Welcome back, my friends. We are looking at enhancing the Metro Map project from the WiByte Python Curriculum, available at www.wibyte.in. In the previous video, we saw how we could add a base fare to the whole fare calculation, and that makes it kind of interesting. Now, in this video, we'll see one more such dimension. Let's say we say, okay, look, there's a certain surcharge to be paid for crossing an interchange. Now, what do I mean by this? If I'm let's say, line and go to another line, then perhaps I have to pay some kind of a surcharge. So remember, with two lines, there is just two possibilities. In fact, with any number of lines, there's just two possibilities. Start and stop stations are on the same line or they are on a different line. Now, if they are on the same line, then I don't pay any surcharge. But if they are on a different line, then I pay a certain surcharge because the user switches trains and we add a surcharge. Now, again, I must add that this may not be really true in practice. I'm not very sure, depending on so many networks in the world. But this is anyway an interesting programming exercise, especially when we think of multiple lines and multiple interchanges. But here we will look at just the two lines that we have been looking at. It's kind of a reasonably simple thing to do because, basically if the start line is not the same as a stop line, then we can say, okay, look, there's a variable n lines crossed and, I just increment that variable. So I set it to 0 to start with. If I end up in the situation, then I just increment it. And like we just discussed that in case of two lines, there can be at most one line crossing. So with this done, in fact, we can say, okay, look, when calculating the fare, I can just add the surcharge based on the n lines crossed. When I have multiple lines, in fact, there may be many crossings, which means that we have to keep track of how many times a line is being crossed, uh, even if these are not the start and stop lines. Because remember, if I have, let's say, 5 lines on the network, then I might go from starting line to some intermediate line to another intermediate line to another intermediate line and so on. But every time I cross this, I must increment this, let's say, n lines crossed. But this is for later. For now, let's just solve it for, let's say, 2 lines, because that creates intuition. So I come in here. Remember, if my start line is same as stop line, nothing changes here. So I'm going to just say, well, to start with, I'm going to set a variable called, let's say, n lines crossed to, to say 0, because that's reasonable. Now, if this happens, for example, if my start line and stop line are not the same, then I can just say n lines crossed is, let's say, 1, or I could say n lines crossed plus 1. Now, this done, I can have, let's say, some kind of let's say line crossing, say surcharge, and let's say that is 10 rupees. So I'm going to say, look, once I calculate my fare, I am going to just add this line crossing surcharge to the, to the fare. So I just go and say, well, fare is equal to fare plus, let's say, n lines crossed, number of lines that I've crossed, times, let's say, line crossing surcharge. So which means that every time I stay on the same line, I don't pay the surcharge. But if I do cross lines, then I pay this surcharge. Now notice this indentation has to be to the base level because fare is computed first and then I go and add this. Now, when I run this code, let's say I'm on the on the scratch line alone. So I say, okay, look, take me from sprite line to say my blocks. So that fare is say 120 rupees because there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stations in between. But on the other hand, let's say I want to go from sprite line to say some line on the on the Python line, some station on the Python line. Then when I calculate fare, notice it is 170 rupees because it was 160 just by the stations plus a 10 rupee surcharge was added. We can see a reverse situation is also, let's say I start from say escape character and I go to say costumes. Now again, in this case, I am going 1, 2, 3, 4 stations. So that should have been, let's say, 80 rupees. But when I calculate the fare here, I see 90 rupees because for crossing that line, I'm paying a surcharge. Now, like I said, this will get quite interesting if we have many more lines on the network. We'll have to do all of this a little bit more smartly. But for now, this is sufficient. Gives you an idea. And I hope you found this interesting. In general, if you think this way of learning is interesting, it makes learning programming more enjoyable, look at our website because we have many such activities. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.